One important thing to consider when you're writing any sort of argumentation, so that includes literary analysis essays and of course research papers, is how you frame your quotes. And we often talk about it in terms of the context that you use, but sometimes it's as simple as what word or phrase you put in front of your quote as you enter into it. So let's talk about how to present quotes. You want to remember IRE, introduce, reproduce, and explain. Let's go through these terms. So when we introduce quotes, we want to make sure that there's some sort of setup or context for the quote that we're using. You can't just put it in there. If it comes out of nowhere, it's like it fell from the sky and it doesn't have anything to do with anything. You want to make sure that you provide some clear context for the quotation. That is an important part of this, okay? Then, of course, there's making sure that you have a clear signal. That is an indicator that a quote is about to be used. Our signal phrases and the verbs that we use to indicate a quote are very important, as they also demonstrate the significance and the importance of the content contained within the quote. So signal phrases are what you're going to want to pay attention to. Here are some signal phrases. So you might say, as Williams claims, and then you'd introduce the quote. Or another author contends that the Williams argument is false. Then you go into that author and you'd say Johnson rejects Williams' argument. These particular verbs are very active verbs that demonstrate the context of the content of the quote that you are about to introduce. So pay attention to this particular slide as you are trying to figure out a word or phrase that you can use to indicate or signal that a quote is about to come. That is called a signal phrase. So here are some examples of signal phrases in context. Television psychologist Dr. Phil offered the odd argument that, and here we enter into the quote, all right? Now the ellipses are merely put there to indicate that more is about to come. That does not mean that you use an ellipses there, unless of course you're shortening the quote. So you'll just go right into the quote. It's merely for demonstration purposes. Do not copy that. All right, so the second thing, so the first thing was introduce. That's signal phrases. It's making sure it doesn't appear out of nowhere. Then we want to reproduce. So as it says in the highlight there, quotations should support your argument, not replace it. In other words, you're using the quote kind of to restate what it is that you're saying. You use the quote to make the argument, and then you reproduce it. That is, you restate it in your own words. You can't let the quote speak for itself. As I often say, imagine that we read stuff in different languages, and we really do, because we come to everything with different types of experiences. You read a quote through one lens and through one interpretation. I might read it through another lens or another interpretation. If you do not reproduce it, that is, you do not translate it into your own words in a way that makes me understand what it is that it's saying, then you're not actually using the quote to any mechanism. You're just letting a quote stand on its own, and you're letting the person who reads your essay decide for themselves what that quote might or might not mean. You need to make sure that you reproduce, that is, restate the quote in your own words in the framing of the argument you are trying to make. So you reproduce a quote. You want to make sure that you're doing it in a way where the original language is there, but you're writing it in your own word, or you're changing it so that it's not too complex, or you're making sure that it fits within the context of your argument, okay? It is very important you translate the quote so that the reader understands it through your interpretation. The third point is to explain. So we had introduced with signal phrases, we had reproduce, which is where you restate it in your own words in the context of your argument, and now we have explain. So as a general rule, you need to explain how the quote proves your point. And you might feel like you're redundant. That is, you might feel like you're saying the same thing over and over again. And that's because you've been looking at your topic for so long, it just makes sense to you. You need to assume that the person reading your paper has never, ever looked at anything related to the topic about which you are writing. Therefore, it is really important that you explain it as if the reader has absolutely no idea what is going on. This is often called the tie to the thesis. As a general rule, what I like to say to people, for every one sentence of quotation, you need at least 3 sentences of translation and explanation. And that would include the reproduction and the explanation pieces. How are you tying this to your thesis? As it says in the third bullet, show how you are using the quotation to support your argument, okay? So here's an example. This quote is just kind of dropped in there. Many leaders want to kill the enemy that destroyed their homes and terrorize their people. I risked my life when I was young. Now I'm old, as a king, etc. And he goes to fight the dragon. Okay, well, that doesn't actually tell me anything. If I skip the quote, do I understand what the paragraph is about? I don't. All I have is many leaders would want to kill the enemy that destroyed their homes and terrorize their people. So he selfishly goes alone to fight the dragon. That doesn't make any sense. I should be able to skip the quote, still understand what the quote said, because all the quote does is reiterate the point that I'm making. It proves you're correct. Think about it as photographic evidence. So here's an example where it is in great detail, okay? You can see the difference. Beowulf vows to kill the enemy that destroyed his home and terrorized his people. Although he has recently killed the monster Grendel with his bare hands, the elderly warrior realizes he is no longer in his prime. He contemplates fighting the dragon. Beowulf laments, I risked my life often when I was young. Now I am old, but as a king of the people, I shall pursue this fight for the glory of winning. Here is where, don't say we though, here is where it is clear that Beowulf is committing mistakes. His motives for fighting are tragically flawed. He does not wish to strike down the monster to ensure the safety of his kingdom and people, yet he seeks fame, longing to recapture the glory of his youth. So he selfishly goes alone to fight the dragon. If I read it again and skip the quote, I know what the paragraph is about. I know what it is proving. The quote serves as my photographic evidence that my statements are in fact correct. So here are more examples. Here it is broken down into the different pieces. So you can see how we are introducing, explaining, reproducing, okay? And also further explaining. So you've got the signal points and to introduce the quote. So it is really important that you are introducing your quotes, that you are reproducing your quotes, that you are explaining your quotes. The quote doesn't prove your point. It is how you explain the quote that proves your point. Good luck.